And in this one, I want to talk about another country many miles away from Uganda in Southeast Asia, and this country is Myanmar, also sometimes still known as Burma. And I want to talk about this because last November there was an election in the country, and Aung San Suu Kyi, the famous Nobel Prize winner, her party won the election in a landslide, and many hope this would mark a new, more democratic era for the people of Myanmar. However, last week, the military took over and announced on the public broadcasting service that they would be taking over for a year of national emergency, having arrested Aung San Suu Kyi, who is under house arrest, as well as many other significant leaders of the opposing party. Now, the military are very interesting in Myanmar, and this isn't the first time they've done this, and that's why in this video I want to take a look at the more recent history of Myanmar and how come the army, the military junta, is coming back into power today. To understand the complex relationship between Myanmar's army and its government, we have to look back at history. Already from very early times, its location between China to the east and India in the west both had an important role in shaping its culture and its traditions. So it got Buddhism from India in the west, which was incredibly important and is still the majority religion that is followed in the country today. Now, its first kingdom to actually incorporate the entirety of what is now Myanmar was called the Pagan Kingdom, and the name is a bit misleading because it's named after a place name rather than its rulers being pagan, because they were already Buddhist at this point. And over the centuries, it and its successors started to incorporate more and more of the smaller ethnicities and kingdoms around it, until it was really quite a large entity in and of itself, which attracted the attention in the early modern period of several European nations looking to colonize and to trade. The main ones here were the British, as in the form of the East India Company in India, and the French, who would of course conquer French Indochina, as well as the Portuguese, who had interests in the region. Although in the end it would be the British that would play the largest role in Burmese history, as in 1826 they would invade part of the country in what became known as the First Anglo-Burmese War, at the end of which they annexed the parts that they wanted closest to India. Now, the reason it's called the First Anglo-Burmese War is because in 1852 they did it all over again, and the British invaded once more and decided to attach the area that was known as Lower Burma to their own territory. And in 1885 there was a Third Anglo-Burmese War, and at the successful conclusion of this for the British, the kingdom fell and it was incorporated into the British Raj, making up the easternmost part of a political entity that stretched right through what is now Bangladesh, India, parts of Nepal, and Pakistan. The situation changed in 1937 when Burma became a separately administered colony of the British Empire, its first Prime Minister being a certain Ba Maw, who was a proponent of Burmese self-rule and also was ardently opposed to Britain's role in the Second World War as this started to unfold. Someone who shared his point of view was Aung San, a Burmese communist who went to try and gain support for a communist revolution inside the country from the Chinese. Of course, the Chinese were fighting their own guerrilla war, first against the Kuomintang government and then against the Japanese occupation. But in a strange twist of fate, actually ended up meeting a Japanese Imperial Army officer while in Thailand, who promised that he could gain Burmese independence for him. And so he went back with 29 of his comrades and founded what became known in 1940 as the Burma Independence Army, or BIA, which would support the Japanese effort when they attacked Burma. This they did 2 years later in 1942, and when the Japanese invaded, the BIA had swelled its ranks very quickly, and it was able to help the Japanese in driving the British out. But basically, the British defense of their territories in Burma was an absolute shambles, and the Japanese drove them out of the country in a matter of months. So at this point, a puppet government was set up in Burma, and the BIA became the BNA, or that is to say, the Burmese National Army, because there was now a separate puppet state that was working for the Japanese for all intents and purposes, but independent from the British. The British, of course, didn't give up and launched several of their famous Chindit raids from their base of operations in India, and by 1944 they and the other allies had actually mounted another invasion of Burma and drove the Japanese out of the country. Now, realizing what was going on, Aung San and the BNA switched sides and joined with the British against the Japanese. And it's probably because of this that in 1945, at the war's conclusion, he signed the Panglong Agreement with the British, which essentially ensured that Burma would become a separate, independent country. However, Aung San would not live to see this, as in 1947 he and several other politicians were assassinated by rival members. But in 1948, Burma did indeed become an independent country known as the Union of Burma. The reason it's called the Union is because within Burma there are an exceptional amount of different ethnic groups and small minority languages and cultures, as you can see on this map. And this will become very important because even though in the constitution it mentioned that it would be some kind of federalized state with all of these areas having some level of control, arguments about what this exactly meant soon bubbled to the surface. In the first decades after its independence, the country of Burma saw many different uprisings happening among these ethnicities, as well as several attempts to power from various communist groups, often being supplied by communist China just across the border. This very much worried the army because they felt that they couldn't start to let any of these ethnicities go because there were simply so many of them that the country would fracture. And this led in 1962 to a coup d'etat which saw the army take control of the government and install their own Ne Win as the new head of state in Burma. This turned the country into a one-party communist state, at the head of which was the organisation known as the BSPP, or the Burma Socialist Programme Party. Now this may seem slightly surprising to some who have studied history before, because a lot of the time the army, especially the upper ranks of the army, aren't exactly in favour of a communist takeover. Now we see examples of this, let's say in the Spanish Civil War, as well as in Germany during the Weimar period, that actually the army are some of the most conservative figures there are and really don't like the kind of radical communist ideas of uprooting things. So it's a bit strange perhaps that we see this happening here. But remember the 30 comrades that I mentioned earlier on that Aung San brought from Burma to aid the Japanese in their invasion? Well, Ne Win, who is now in power, was none other than one of those founding members. And the fact that essentially what was a communist military insurgency was what started the BNA, which obviously switched sides from helping the Japanese to helping the British, that became the army in Burma. That became the Burmese army. And that's why we have a communist kind of leadership of the army, which is why they actually brought about a communist revolution in Burma themselves. Business, media and production were all nationalized alongside a whole scheme of central planning, and this turned the country into what had been one of the most affluent and promising in Asia, sometimes known as the Tiger of Asia, into one of the poorest, suffering the worst growth in GDP of all Asian countries at the time. In 1974, a new constitution was drafted, but this basically just confirmed that the BSPP and Ne Win were the party in control, and that was that. Things did change in 1981 when presidential elections and multi-party system was promised, but Ne Win became the first president, so really not much did actually change. It's in 1988 that really a huge thing happened. And this is what became known as the 8888 protests, or the 8888 Uprising, named after the date on the 8th of August 1988. There have been many protests against the BSPP before, but nothing like this, becoming symbolized on this known as the Fighting Peacock flag. It was sparked by economic changes that happened a year earlier in 1987. The country was billions of dollars in debt and needed to find a way to repay these debts. One way that they thought would be a good idea was actually to take away the money that was out there already and to take away the bills of 175, 35 and 25 kyat, leaving just the bills of 45 and 90, because Ne Win, and this is what he actually thought they were divisible by 9, which meant that they were lucky numbers. In March in 1988, things really boiled over when groups of youth supporting the different parties came to blows and the police seemed to favour one over the other. And so many more people went out on the street, which led to much more violent police crackdown, and this fueled the cycle of protest against the entire system. In June, this had got so bad that Ne Win actually promised to resign, but had already appointed his successor as president, someone who the protesters knew as the Butcher of Rangoon, which, as you can tell, isn't a great precedent nor a great president. In August, the protest reached fever pitch, and this is when none other than Aung San Suu Kyi addressed the crowds. She, of course, is the daughter of the aforementioned Aung San, the father of Burmese independence, who was assassinated just before the country achieved that goal in 1948. She had left the country, although her mother had also been part of the government before the military coup, but had returned to speak to the people and to lead them forwards in a non-violent protest against the army, telling them not to kill the police or the army, but to find a way to move forwards together, which is much of the reason why she won a Nobel Prize. Of course, Ne Win and his regime didn't want to give up so easily, and it seemed that this would be an incredibly difficult thing to accomplish for the protesters, and yet hundreds of thousands came out into the street to protest against the police brutality and the entire system. In September, a referendum was held on whether they would allow multi-party system in Burma for the first time since 1962, and 90% of the party delegates voted in favour of this resolution. However, the BSPP held on to power, saying that they would organise an election within a month, though the protesters wanted them to resign and an interim government that was more balanced and wouldn't rig it to actually run it in the meantime. Now, the protests continue to get more and more violent, and in later September, the army actually really cracked down on the protests even harder than before, luring protesters into skirmishes, which they would then easily win, with the death toll rising. Ne Win is quoted as having said, "If the army shoots, it has no tradition of shooting into the air. It shoots straight to kill." And with a rhetoric like this, it's easy to understand why so many people lost their lives during this period in Burmese history. Now, it's at this point that a general of the army, Sao Maung, led a coup d'etat against the BSPP government at this time. He and an organisation called SLORC, or SLORC, because SLORC sounds ridiculous, it stands for the State Law and Order Restoration Council. They took over and, in a really harsh crackdown on the protests, shut everything down. They killed everyone who protested against them, and by the end of the year, the hope for democracy that had seemed so close for the Burmese people had gone up in flames once more as this new military junta came to power and held on to power there. Around 10,000 people, that's the upper estimate for the number of people who died during 1988 in the protests against the government, a lot of those in this takeover by the military junta at the end of the year. In 1989, SLORC changed the name of the country from the Socialist Republic of the Union of Burma just back to the Union of Myanmar. This is the first time the country gets called Myanmar, and why there is sometimes confusion about the two names, with some still using the older name. In 1990, they did actually fulfill the promise of holding an election. This would be for the first time since the early 1960s that there would be such an election in Myanmar since the military had taken over. And in this election, they found that 80% of the votes went to the NLD, that is to say, the National League for Democracy, the party of Aung San Suu Kyi. But the party did not respect the vote, and so the military junta remained in power until 1997, when they once again, the SLORC, they changed to the SPDC, this standing for the State Peace and Development Council, which was a rebranding, but again not a changeover in power on their part. Now, in 2007, there would be many more protests against them. This is because of the increasing price of oil and fuel. They were the only ones in Burma that were able to distribute it, the government, and so this rose to about 60 to 100% more than it had been. And this sparked what became known as the Saffron Revolution. Saffron because it was spearheaded, as many of the protests and attempted revolutions in Myanmar had been, by monks, by the Buddhist monks. That's why it's named after the saffron colour. And this was violently cracked down upon, with several monks being killed. In 2010, following a 2008 resolution to make a disciplined democracy, the junta decided to actually move in that direction and announced that the Union of Myanmar would change its name to the Republic of the Union of Myanmar as a result of this. And they moved towards having an election. I won't say it's a free and fair election, because when they had it, it came out as 80% of the voters supporting the USDP, which is the Union Solidarity and Development Party, essentially the party of the army. And the UN and several other organizations found that there was widespread fraud going on in the election, and that's why the results couldn't be trusted. However, in 2011, the military junta was dissolved, and there have been liberalizing programs going through, such as as a move towards a mixed economy, liberalization, as well as others, such as the fact that Aung San Suu Kyi was released from house arrest and was able to help her party in more ways than she had actually been able to, which does all look like it's going in the right direction, though some people feared that the army was secretly trying to embed themselves within politics, as in, like they'd said, disciplined democracy, before being able to take power once more. In 2015, there was another election. Now, Aung San Suu Kyi is not allowed to run for president. She is in fact constitutionally barred from doing so. However, another high-ranking member of her party, the NLD, is, and he became the president. He is called Tin Cho, and he works closely with the state councillor, which is a special position that was created for Aung San Suu Kyi, given all that she has done for democracy within the country. That is until 2020, when there was another election in November, as I mentioned at the very start of the video, which the NLD won in a landslide. However, the army wasn't going to let this stand, and they claimed that there was widespread voter fraud and that therefore the election was not valid. And they claimed that they would take action if nothing else was done. That brings us to last week in 2021, and the general called Min Aung Hlaing, who was the leader of the coup d'etat, which saw the streets blocked off and Aung San Suu Kyi and the other members, the leading members of the NLD, put under house arrest. Now, the possible reason why is that they were passing a bill that said that army generals would have to retire at the age of 65. And guess how old our general here is? He is 64, so that seems to me like a likely reason for this coup having taken place, as well as the fact that within the current constitution, the army gets to choose a quarter of the representatives within the parliament, and this may also have come under threat by this new NLD government in 2020. This was also done the day before that the new government would be sworn in, so it's clearly been well timed and premeditated. There's also the fact that this general and several others have been involved in a genocide against the Rohingya people, Muslim people in the extreme west of the country, and that it's quite likely that things about what they had done, their war crimes, would have come to the surface within inquiries in the country if they had continued, and it's possibly also a cover-up for that, as well as the fact that to combat the coronavirus, the country had been given by international donors $350 million to use as they wished without any need to pay it back, and it's possible that the army also wanted to basically jump on that gravy train and use that for their own means. But that is the story so far. We're not sure how this is going to play out. This is very much a current event that's going on, but as I've demonstrated in this video, this is nothing new. The army has constantly been involved in Burmese independence. That's why they got independence in the first place in the 1940s. And let's just hope that things calm down for the people of Burma and that they get back on the right track. But anyway, that is enough for now because, well, this is the most recent that we can talk about. And I hope that you have enjoyed this video, this look into the history of Burma, or Myanmar as it's being called now as well.